Our final plenary this morning is protecting and upholding American ideals. And there will be time at the end to ask questions. So have your questions ready, and as you saw before, we will have someone out there to answer your, with a microphone so your questions can be answered. And I'm pleased to welcome a fantastic group of speakers again. Haven't the ones that we've had so far been just excellent and right on target? This has been well planned, so National Immigration Forum, thank you for such wonderful planning in this. As we address, and this will be addressing anxieties about immigrants and immigration as they relate to culture and security. And our moderator for this final plenary is Mindy Belz. Mindy is the senior editor at World Magazine. Let's give Mindy a big hand and welcome her. And the panel will follow, and Mindy, I'll ask you to introduce the panel. And just remember that people are going to be eating with lettuce hanging out of their teeth, but we're going to enjoy and really listen to what you're saying. So thank you so much, Mindy.
Thank you. Good day, afternoon. Actually, technically morning. I want to introduce Sheriff Margaret Mims from Fresno, California. You have bios in your program, so I'll just do this briefly. Scott McConnell with LifeWay Research. Shirley Hoogstra, the head of CCCU, Christian College Coalition, and Meghan Smith. Meghan is working with an organization in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and will tell you more about that. And I want to begin this way. My title is Senior Editor at World News Group. My work, primarily over too many decades to count, has been covering international events and international conflict. And it's been in that context of seeing the situations that people are coming from that I have come in contact with the issue of immigration and refugee admissions, and increasingly seeing my work in the Middle East take me to Europe, where many Middle Eastern refugees now are finding life, and bring me into communities in the US. So the first thing I want to do is ask each of you, if you wouldn't mind, and we'll begin with Sheriff Mims, to talk a little bit, because you are experts in your fields, but your field is not primarily about immigration. So I'd like you to just talk about how you came into contact with the issue and how that contact has affected your work and where you are on that.
Sure. I'm from Fresno, California, and our location is in the central San Joaquin Valley, which is about halfway between San Francisco and Los Angeles, to give you an idea. Very high agricultural economy in Fresno County. And several years ago, one of our packing businesses, it was a fruit packing business, had an I-9 audit, which means Homeland Security came in to check the records of the employees. And as it turned out, hundreds of people whose paperwork weren't in order were laid off of work. So they required the employer to lay people off, not employ them. They fined the employer, and it was not helpful, nor was it productive. There's a very critical time in our fruit packing season where that crop has got to go, because it's vital, or else it'll rot. And what I did is I ended up sending a letter to Senator Feinstein and said, this happened. What I need Homeland Security to help me do is fight transnational gangs, human trafficking, transnational narcotic trafficking. And the I-9 audits just were not productive. And the next thing I know, I'm getting a call from Ali, and the rest is history.
Scott, tell us a little bit.
LifeWay Research surveys the church and the culture, trying to help church leaders stay in tune with what's happening in our society today. And so in our just course of normal polling questions, we asked several questions about immigration, and we began to see a disconnect between the sentiments of Protestant pastors and laity and what we see as our infrastructure here in the United States. And so whenever you see a contrast like that, it becomes an even better research topic for the future. And we've had the opportunity to partner with a couple different organizations to dig deeper on the topic of immigration and to understand it better.
Good, Shirley.
So Mindy, I knew about immigration issues because I'm an attorney, but when I took this role, we knew that the students on our campuses might also be DACA students. One of the things that the CCCU does is we try to be a good resource for our campuses. My colleague, Shirley Maglio, said, you know what, Shirley, we really need to understand this immigration issue better because it's becoming an important conversation. Should you give financial aid? Should you have DACA students come and be part of your campus? So we participated in an experience called the Global Immersion Experience Project, the Global Immersion Project. And that was a profound experience. You actually get to go on an immersion experience. We first started in San Diego, and we heard from a DACA student, a young high school woman who was not able to go to college. She actually found out that she was not a citizen when she got accepted into college. But then we also went down and we talked to people who had been deported in Tijuana. And we saw what the church was doing there, and we talked to mothers who had been separated from their families. We also talked to the border guards, said, what is it like, to be in this space? So it was really well-rounded, and it made such a profound impact. And I came away saying we can do better in finding a solution, and we really wanted to support our DACA students on our campuses.
So I'm Meghan Smith. If you look in your program, you'll see that Russ Moore is supposed to be up here. I am now Russ Moore, so I'm glad to talk to y'all today. I'm from South Carolina, and I recently went on a trip to the border with a group of evangelical women. There's 3 of them over there, so y'all raise your hands. They'll be happy to talk about the trip as well. And it was also going to the border and really seeing and witnessing the legal process and the barriers that several families encounter when trying to request asylum. We went into ICE detention facility and processing centers, and also went over into Mexico to talk with those who were waiting to apply for asylum. And in South Carolina, I work as the Director of College and Career Readiness for a nonprofit and for our Chamber of Commerce. So I'm able to approach immigration from a college readiness and a workforce side.
Good, thank you. I want to, we've heard today about sort of the dire situation for the labor force for corporations and agriculture. We've heard about how immigration is shifting political alliances and views and even elections. But Scott, I'd like to begin with you to talk a little bit about the research and what it's telling us about it. Is this a crisis, and do people in your world perceive it as a crisis?
As we've surveyed Christians, and especially among evangelicals, there's definitely a blurring of the lines between those who are documented, those who are not, those who are here legally, and those who are not. And the assumption is, if you bring up the topic of immigration, is that we're only talking about those who are here illegally, that don't have paperwork. And honestly, the sentiments from Christians are actually very different depending on the conversation. If we're talking about legal immigrants, those who've come through the process, there's actually a lot of admiration. There's a lot of support for those people. And in fact, many people can tell stories from their own family of how they've gone through that, stories of their friends. But again, their sentiments are almost the opposite when it comes to those who do not have documentation. And so there's a direct opposition. And some of that is, could be from religious roots, in that the heart of the Christian faith is to remove our transgressions. And in our system today, and in the Christian faith, that is through Jesus Christ that our sins are removed. But in our country today, if you're undocumented, in most cases there is not a path, there is not a way to achieve legal status. And so as much as Christians want that resolved, We have not created that path, and we've in fact created an underclass and really an unjust system.
Shirley, you have come at this issue a little bit differently, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about just what you see on the college campuses that are part of CCU, how many DACA students you have, and how they're perceived on campus. Are they welcome? Are they, what do they face there?
Yeah, thank you. So we have over 145 campuses in the United States, and they are all across the country, 38 different states. And I would say that the majority of our campuses have DACA students. And it's actually sort of a two-way kind of conversation, because for DACA students, it is their personal story. And so they might want to be more present or more visible on their campus, but then there is always a risk because their families, of course, are not documented. And so what would that mean? But the students, once they know that they have DACA students there, they really fully embrace them. They want to be supportive. When political things are happening in the news, they are aware that that's impacting their student friends in a really direct way. In fact, today, Anna and Marilyn are here from Lee University. Just stand up a minute. They are DACA students, and they a senior and a sophomore. And they said, you know, we're going to say something more, and they wanted to come today so that they could tell their story to the legislators, because they knew that being quiet was not going to necessarily move the conversation. So that's the sort of thing that's happening on the campuses.
And where are you from? I didn't hear.
Lee, Tennessee.
Okay.
Lee University, and they're from Mexico and El Salvador, and Lee University is in Tennessee.
Great. Great. Have you had the opportunity to work with DACA students, or I'm just curious how that issue has, in Spartanburg where you are, how that's come to play out, and what you see as sort of the perceptions within the community toward those?
Yeah, we also have a lot of DACA recipients. And one thing that we've been working on a state level is DACA recipients cannot receive in-state tuition, state scholarships, or professional licenses like teaching or nursing, welding, cosmetology. And so one thing that we've been working on over the last year and a half is to try to get a bill passed through our state legislature that would provide those things, because we, in South Carolina, we have a terrible teacher shortage and nursing shortage. But we have DACA students who are going to our colleges, graduating, and our state won't give them a teaching license, so they'll go out of state. And so we as a chamber have really gotten involved in that issue. If we're going to grow our workforce, we have to be able to provide these students with licenses.
What's the status of that legislation?
It didn't get out of committee last year, and the Republican legislator that championed it was just reelected. He took a real risk championing that. And so once this next session starts, we're going to hit the ground running again.
Is there active opposition?
They're not as organized as we are, but when you start talking to people, the opposition comes up. And it's very much along the lines probably of what we all hear, in that it's a zero-sum game. That if we give state scholarships to a DACA student, then that means my grandchild won't receive a scholarship. And so it's a lot of having to unpack some of those misconceptions and explain that it's not a static pie. The pie grows with us as students contribute and get jobs and contribute to the economy.
And that's one of the real fears among Americans, and particularly in Christians, is that there is kind of a fixed pie of resources, and if immigrants, and especially undocumented immigrants, are receiving those resources, then that means citizens are not. And that's a tension, that's a fear that exists, and I think it leads to some of the behavior that we see.
Sheriff Mims, I wanted to turn to you and ask, because we also see a divergence of views among law enforcement across the country, and specifically where you are. I mean, I've talked with a couple who are here, you know, who face these challenges of what level of cooperation, and what does that cooperation look like with federal authorities. What have you found, and what do you see in terms of the perceptions both where you are and among law enforcers that you are in contact with?
Sure. California passed a Senate bill last year prohibiting local law enforcement from communicating with ICE in certain circumstances, which I disagree with, frankly, because it's polarizing. Just like the group that says deport everybody, you know, having the sanctuary for everybody, it's polarizing, and I don't think that's right. And again, as a basic philosophy, I don't believe local governments, a state government, should tell a local law enforcement who they can talk to and who they can't when it comes to keeping our communities safe. I don't think that's optimal. But that's what happened in California. So, and it's different in different states. When you talk about communication with ICE specifically, it's all over the board across the United States. Some states is full cooperation, no holds barred, and others like California that I can't talk to ICE about certain people I know in my community that could be dangerous. In other words, I can't prevent crime, and that's troublesome.
And how, so in lieu of that, how have you, I mean, I guess because we're in a public forum, you might not want to say this, but are there ways around that? Are there ways that you, I mean, in the effort to keep the community safe, are there things that you're doing?
There's no way around a law that I have to obey, you know.
Sure.
So, and I'm going to obey the laws in the state. So I just have to very carefully make that decision about when we do cooperate, are we within law, are we within policy? Yeah. That's very important for us to do, because I'm not immune. You know, I can be held personally accountable for anything that I or my staff, I have 1,300 people working in the sheriff's office. Yeah. And so I'm personally liable for every one of those people. Yeah. So we're going to comply with the state law. There's no way around some of the law. Some of it is very vague, and so some of that might have to play out in courts to decide, you know, whether or not a decision was lawful or not. But we have to obey the state law.
So when you and your staff are forced to make these calls, I mean, do you come away from that thinking that immigrants are a benefit to the community or a detriment?
Well,
I mean,
yeah, one of the things I think is really important for everyone to understand is just because we cooperate with ICE to the level that we can, we're anti-immigrant, when that's absolutely not true. What is true is I'm anti-criminal activity. So if we have people that commit crimes, they're going to be held accountable. No, and I also do not believe that our immigrant community commit crimes at a higher level than the rest of our communities. Our statistics just do not prove that out. But those that are here that commit crimes, and in fact, many of their crimes are committed and they victimize other immigrants, that can be very heartbreaking.
Sure. How do you build trust with that community?
Yeah, we continually have to fight the rhetoric that's out there about the sheriff communicates with ICE, so the whole immigrant community needs to be afraid, when that's absolutely not true. In fact, I have to very aggressively let our immigrant community know that I can actually recommend a U visa if you're a victim of a crime and cooperate and report. Last year, I helped over 100 immigrants be here legally with U visas, so that they've got, I think it's good for 3 years, so they're able to not only say I was victimized, but then they have the trust of law enforcement because we're the ones recommending they're here legally. So I think that's an important message to get out, that if you're a victim of a crime, law enforcement doesn't ask for your papers. And in fact, in California, I don't know of one law enforcement agency that says prove you're here legally. That's not a question we ask. You're a victim, you're treated like a victim. And that's important, I believe. Now, The problem with the U visa is there's only 10,000 issued throughout the whole country in a year. So when some people find out, oh, I can get a U visa, and they want to report a crime that happened in 2001, I have to say, sorry, it has to be a recent crime, because these visas they're not infinite. It's very small numbers, so we save those for current crime victims. But that's how we try to fight that. If you're a victim of crime, don't be afraid of law enforcement. In fact, we can help you be here legally.
So I'm hearing from you and other talking about the language, talking about documented versus undocumented. I mean, language is very important here, and how we talk about immigrants in the particular categories, and how we talk about how we all relate to each other matters a great deal. And so I'm just wondering, Scott, if you would touch on this, but any of you, because you're all dealing with it, how does the language affect the way that immigrants are? I mean, you alluded to it initially in your research, affect the way that immigrants are perceived. And as all of you think about, what are some biblical principles that you find yourself relying on in how you use language, and that you think we should all be thinking about?
I mean, I think as we've interviewed Christians, they're often very quick to throw the illegal label out there, and they're talking about the status, but it begins to sound like a label on the person, and takes some of the personhood away by using the label. And so, quickly others on a different side of the debate would hear that, and suddenly the walls go up, and we're having a very polar debate. And unfortunately, a lot of the dialogue about immigration has been very polar, very binary, rather than talking about gradations and the details of the issue. And so, some civil dialogue is something that's very needed in this space, and something that's going to take quite a bit to encourage, because that particular point is very important to Christians. Enjoying the fact that our nation has rules that make our society work better. My cab driver last night was a legal immigrant, been in the country.
Did you ask him?
No, he brought it up.
Okay.
I did say I was here for a conference on immigration.
Told him you were.
And he was kind of like, so what do you think about me? But he was very thankful that when he went to get a driver's license in the United States, there were rules that said if he passed the test, he gets the license. There were no other questions of who gets it, who doesn't. And he said in the country he came from, there likely would have been bribes that would have to be paid for him to get that license. And some people would get it, some people would not. And so it is those rules that many of us appreciate and we want. And so many people just feel threatened. And so the fear walls go up when they say, here's somebody who broke a law. And instead of continuing the conversation to talk about the person. And that's really the heart of Scripture. I can't get past Deuteronomy 10 where God, in a section talking about justice, actually switches the verb and says, I love the resident alien who lives among you, and then bids that his people do the same.
Good. Anyone else?
Well, this idea about the phrase illegal alien, and in fact, before I was close to this topic, that was the phrase that was used, illegal alien. This idea of alien is so foreign, right? Someone very, and now when we use language like an undocumented person, or doesn't have lawful entry, there are ways in which we can bring the personhood first. But I do think, and I think LifeWay taught us this, it is important when you're speaking to an audience to perhaps use indicate that you understand that as an advocate for immigration reform, that you understand there's been either a lawful or an unlawful entry. And when you say that, your listener will actually say, okay, she gets it or he gets it. But now they will say, but let's look at persons that need a solution. We live in America. Couldn't we do better problem solving around that? And then go into that kind of language. I think language really matters.
Yeah. And do you find, I mean, on college campuses, I mean, often students can lead the way for us on this, and so I think, you know, the alien minor designation that so doesn't necessarily capture a lot of people who fit, who actually qualify, would be considered dreamers. Are students helping us? I mean, have you?
There's a number of student-initiated sort of things that go on campus. And first of all, what the beauty of a college campus, as you all remember probably, is that you can have conversations. You can strike them up. You can organize. Students can say, you know, is it a good idea from a rule of law point of view? Or how do we really live out Matthew 25, welcoming a stranger? They also can say, you know what, if we have a problem, let's make sure that people know what resources are available. So they started workshops and said, here are your legal resources, and here's because people, like you were just saying, people don't always know, like Margaret said, whether or not you can call the police. So what are the rules? And that actually lowers, as you said, Scott, lowers the anxiety, helps people live better, of course helps students be better students.
Mm-hmm.
I think about what Senator Bennett said about people don't feel welcomed unless we tell them that
Yes.
they're welcome.
Yeah.
And so our language, you know, not even just talking to, you know, an American trying to convince them about this issue, but when you're talking to an immigrant or a person of color or anyone who's different than you, is your language going to make them feel welcoming, or is it going to immediately put up barriers between you and that person, and they're going to know this person is not safe for me to talk to?
So if we're talking about values and perceptions, I want to pull even a little bit further back, because it seems to me I've heard some great stories. We have some people who are here from diverse, multicultural churches that have done a lot of great work with refugees and with immigrants. But we know that there's this element of fear. If we even talk specifically among church communities, but maybe fear that the majority Anglo-Saxon culture of America is disappearing, and that we're watching our communities become more and more colorful. And you know, for a number of us, that's a good thing, but it's not a good thing for everybody. And so I'm wondering just what sort of, if you would speak a little bit to the fear and distrust that you encounter. And Meghan, I'd like to start with you, but I'd like to hear from each of you in your own community. What does that look like? How does it present itself?
I see that there's fear and distrust on both sides. There's fear and distrust among the immigrants that I work with, fear to drive your child to school, fear and distrust of the majority culture there. But then, like you said, there's also that fear, and we've been talking about it today, of my predominant culture is disappearing. And I think, yeah, in Spartanburg, in South Carolina, we see that played out every single day, especially among parents at our schools. I used to teach an adult English class, and as soon as 2016 election and all of the rhetoric came up, we hardly had any students anymore coming because they were afraid to drive, because they felt like our class would be a prime place for some sort of raid. And so the very thing that I hear Americans say, well, they need to learn English. It's like the very rhetoric is preventing that from happening.
Yeah.
And so it often feels like a downward cycle of distrust on top of distrust that just leads more and more polarized. But I think that's the power that the church has, is it can be, I don't even mean a building, but the people, it can be a sanctuary, a place to build that trust of that common ground, that faith that we share, which should be our primary unifying thing, not our nationality, because as Christians, we're supposed to consider ourselves citizens of God's kingdom first. And so I think that the church has that ability, but in the South, and I'd imagine in communities across the U.S., the church is still very segregated, and we're not worshiping together, and we're missing that opportunity to realize that we have that common ground.
Good points.
But I think that it is, I think it's really important to recognize that there is a loss and a sense of grief, right, with change. That's a universal sort of response to change. And then the antidote to that antidote to grief and loss is like, what would replace it? And I think the stories that you hear about people actually starts to warm a place in your heart that maybe a future could be as good or maybe better because of the diversity that could come in. But you don't get there unless you know people or have heard stories. And so to your point, the church, I think if the church were telling the stories, getting those groups together on an incremental, small basis, and obviously our schools and our universities, our colleges, to help tell the stories, whether it's in alumni magazines or having them at scholarship dinners or giving visibility to the way in which the new diversity is actually adding to, so it diminishes the grief.
I think assumptions can be crippling, and sometimes it's our own assumptions can be crippling. A lot of Americans think that we have a homogenous culture in America. And yet if you go even across the regions of our country or to individual cities, you get completely different flavors of who we are as Americans. And so with that wrong assumption as a starting place, they begin to see some signals from immigrants that maybe they're not wanting to adapt. And that's the assumption they're making then about the immigrant. Even though the immigrant's simply going through trying to assimilate in a difficult culture. And so they go near people who are similar to them. And people in the majority culture look at that and say, well, you're not integrating in with the rest of us. You're trying to have this island over here. And there's these false assumptions going back and forth that are pretty natural. When somebody doesn't speak fluent English, the assumption is you're not trying, even though the vast majority of Americans are not fluent in a second language ourselves. And so we don't know how difficult it is because we haven't tried it in our arrogance. And so those assumptions are absolutely crippling as we try to come to common ground and try to do the melting that we all talk about proverbially as what we love about America, and yet it takes effort on both sides.
I think we need to remember this is nothing new. What we're going through right now is not anything we haven't seen throughout history time and time and time again. It's just rose to the level at this particular point in time because we have a situation now. What do we do when Ronald Reagan had the amnesty program I believe we need something like that now, but we need to follow through with the secure borders and the rules and some way for people to be here legally. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and so we end up with millions of people here that are undocumented, and that's why we're talking. Why it's this level of conversation now, but it's nothing new. I feel very fortunate to come from a part of the country in the Central Valley was so diverse. The Armenians came to our area after the genocide. The Hmong and Cambodian and Laotian came to our area after Vietnam. We have such a rich, diverse community in Central California, from Mexico, Central America. I feel very fortunate. And I think people need to start getting on the what do immigrants bring, and what, not just now, but throughout our history, that has enriched where we live and what we eat and how we dress. And I think that's just very, very important to remember that. I believe there's a way to be compassionate, combined with the rule of law, that we can find a way for legality for people that have been here for years and have not committed crimes. You all know that's got to be high on my priority list, that contribute. I think that's very, very important.
Good. I want to turn briefly before we begin the time for questions. Please be thinking about the questions that you have for this panel. I want to turn to refugees. You know, we know that refugees are brought into this country through very different mechanisms and laws. then immigration, as we've been talking about. But we began to see, to my recollection, in 2015, after the Paris attacks, we were in the midst of a presidential campaign. We had no idea how wild it was going to get, but it felt wild even then. And there began to be this movement, and we had state governors saying they would not take in refugees specifically. And from that time, it seems to me that refugees who used to be a category that was very much welcomed in this country because people appreciated what they've been through has now become lumped in with some of the things we've been talking about. And we worry about our security and things. So Scott, I'd like you to talk about, have you done research specifically on perceptions toward refugees? Is the confusion there that I'm describing, or do people simply also have a bad view of refugees? What has LifeWay found out about that?
The specific topic of sentiments toward refugees definitely bleeds into the other topics we've already discussed. Mm-hmm. So some of those fears are there. And honestly, the majority of evangelical Christians believe there's a terrorist threat by having refugees coming to the United States. And obviously the processing that is in place and that's been reviewed is meant to protect us from those fears. Because of some of these fears, 9 out of 10 evangelicals actually agree with the reductions that have taken place, the executive order to reduce the number of refugees. And so it almost feels hopeless when you see a question like that. But when we pose questions about people who are currently here in the United States without documentation, should they be allowed to stay legally? And a couple of the reasons that actually resonate the most among Christians are actually refugee reasons. Escaping war, escaping violence, and persecution. And so there is some empathy there, but that's not going to be the first thing you hear oftentimes if it's brought up in a discussion. But those feelings are there if they know that the security concerns are going to be addressed.
How do you see that playing out on college campuses?
So the immigration issue is a little bit further along in terms of students being able to be part of campuses, but we have a program actually that specifically deals with Syrian refugees. Houghton College up in New York State knew that there were Syrian refugees who had come. They were already coming from educated families. They wanted to begin a college education. But like many students, they don't like to go when they're newcomers to America and have had so much disruption already. They don't want to leave and go to hundreds of miles away to college. So Houghton College went to Buffalo, New York, and started a degree program in Buffalo, New York for Syrians, refugees. Two things happened. Number one, the Syrian families were so grateful. They saw that there was a future. They had so much more hope. The faculty from Houghton also said, these are tremendous students. They work so hard. They have such a clear vision of what they want to accomplish. And so there was such a mutual gain by going both to where the refugee community was. Houghton had to think outside the box. And they also had to get foundation support to do the program because, again, there was some cost that was prohibited. So Houghton went and found donors who believed in this vision of the future.
Mm-hmm. What about refugees in your area? Is that a category that you've been able to work on? Or?
Yes, yeah. In 2015, some of y'all might remember, Spartanburg became a World Relief Refugee Resettlement Site. And it was right in the middle of all of that time that you said, and it became quite the contentious issue. There was a bill that was almost passed at our state level that was going to be very punitive, and thankfully, thanks to Alan Cross and some other pastors, they defeated that bill. Mm-hmm. But I think that where a lot of the fear came for Christians was the Muslim refugees. Mm-hmm. We would hear people say, well, we want to help the Christians. We're a Christian nation. Let's help the Christians. But when you look at the data, that Matt Sorens and his team works on, when we lower the refugee numbers, we're impacting any refugee who wants to come, whatever religion you're a part of. But we've resettled now close to 200 in Spartanburg, and the issues kind of died down a bit. But like you said, it bleeds into the larger discussion about immigration.
Where are they from? Do you know?
Most of them are from the Congo.
Okay.
We've had several from Ukraine, Burma, Myanmar. But the Congo has been most of them. Our governor at the time, Nikki Haley, said we wouldn't take any from Syria. And so we haven't resettled any in Spartanburg from Syria. I don't think she had the authority to say that, but we have refugees also throughout the state. Another fellow South Carolina refugee resettlement guy there. So,
You know, Mindy, people are writing about that fear, and so one of the things that out of Fuller Seminary, one of our faculty members there, Matthew Kemick wrote a book, has just recently wrote a book called Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigrants in the Age of Fear. Right? So just taking that topic and going straight in, because churches might read that, and if there's any resistance, you can be a good storyteller about that. And to that, I just have to just briefly say about a personal story. I belonged to a small church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was changing demographic, and our church was actually reinvigorated because we had a refugee family of 10. We were going to do one, and then Bethany called and said, "Would you take 10?" Well, what are you going to say? No. So we said, we'll take 10.
Yeah.
And you know, that's kind of a critical mass of people. And they came into a small church, and then they brought their friends, and all of a sudden, in literally 18 months, we went from an all-white, fairly old congregation to a multi-ethnic, generationally diverse congregation. And it's not without its tensions, but I think to myself, wow, they are so inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things I love about Matthew's book is that he points out, you know, as you were saying, this is an issue that's been with us, how specifically to deal with Muslim immigration and with some of the tenets of Islam that make it very difficult to not be fearful. And he talks about Abraham Kuyper and how Kuyper even addressed this issue in the Netherlands centuries ago. So thank you. And Sheriff Mims, how do refugees, how does law enforcement, how are the issues different for law enforcement in terms of your refugee population?
Well,
California.
what's very important for me as a law enforcement officer is how are people vetted before they're allowed to come into the country. That's very important to me. And we had a little discussion in the green room about, you know, is this current system adequate? And all I can say is I hope so, you know, because after 40 years in this business, you start thinking like a criminal, right? How many of you can think like a criminal? Nobody raised your hand. That was a trick question. I'm glad you didn't.
The sheriff is asking.
So I'm thinking like a criminal. I'm hearing about the caravan coming, and I'm thinking, if I'm trying to get in the United States, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You're going to join this caravan, right? And so my hope and my faith has to be in that vetting process about allowing people to come in.
Do you feel informed on the vetting process? Because I mean, it seems to me we all have sort of a nebulous idea of what the vetting process is, and as I've been reporting on this issue, it actually began to be tightened under the Obama administration. Right. There's this perception that what we're dealing with now is a new administration, but a number of the vetting procedures followed by the Trump administration came in 2016. Right. Do you have communication? Do you have a sense from federal counterparts of what the vetting that would give you the kind of information that you need?
Sure, we do, and I think what we all need to remember is there's no system that's perfect. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to be perfect because I think there are going to be some people that get through that probably shouldn't. And that's going to locally, when it comes to like politics, crime, everything is local. Mm-hmm. And so how do I keep my community safe in an imperfect system? We're all doing the best that we possibly can to make that happen. And I'll give you an example. We recently had a very large MS-13 investigation in my county. We had 14 homicides in 2 years. related to this very violent gang, and this investigation led to homicides investigations in Houston, in Las Vegas, in Los Angeles, in Maryland, here in DC. It just spiderwebbed, and it really, the scope of the problem was huge. And what we find out is some of the suspects in this case actually came into the United States under the Unaccompanied Children Act. So there's no perfect system. We're all just going to do the best that we can.
I think in this time when we're talking a lot about distrust, as distrust toward people who are different than us has grown, we've also seen a distrust toward institutions and government, and processes that have worked and have never been doubted before are now being brought into question. And it's like a 13 or 18 step vetting process that really, I think, spurred on by the events in Europe and, you know, seeing boats of people washed on the shores. We then began to think that that would be our context, but I think we have to help people understand just geographically where we're placed on the globe, that's not going to be happening
The
here.
boats aren't.
Boats aren't washing up
yeah.
in the same kind of way.
Yeah.
But you see that distrust kind of permeating into all sectors of our lives.
True. Well, that's a good place to wrap up my questions and open it up for your questions.
My name's Anna Rabe. I find it really interesting we're talking about American ideals. I'm an immigrant. I'm also a veteran of an ally, of a US ally, military forces, but I'm also the military spouse of an active duty service member. And within our community, you know, there is a process for those that are serving in the military to have a process towards citizenship. You've heard some things talked about that today. But we certainly have a situation among our families that I wanted to ask you about. So just today, I received a message from a spouse who has been going through the green card process, and her spouse is deployed. And she received a letter threatening deportation action because she was no longer living with her husband.
Oops.
Exactly. That happens more than we would like to think. We have had a number of military spouses in the last year who have been detained, whether their spouses are deployed or not, and some of whom have made the news and have been deported. So I want to kind of ask the question about American ideals and service, and there's always a lot of discussion about supporting the military. We've just had Veterans Day, obviously, and I want to ask you about how you see this process working at the moment, because from the perspective of military families, it doesn't much feel like the process as itself is even functional. And we're talking about security, and of course, I can't begin to tell you how important security is to me, because it is literally a life and death issue for my family. So.
When you're talking, that sounds to me like in a government bureaucracy, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Absolutely. So, just on the face of that, it tells somebody messed up somewhere. In our military, it's probably our largest population with immigrant spouses that we have. So I'm just thinking that, again, it's a process that's not right, needs to be fixed. And there's definitely something seriously wrong when a spouse is deployed and they get that kind of notice. Something's wrong.
Is there legal advocacy within the military to work these cases out when they come up?
Okay, for service members, yes. For family members, no.
Oh, interesting.
None of the services, their legal officers simply do not have the capacity and or legal background to be able to assist family members and dependents with support when it comes to immigration. So people like myself, there are other advocates within the community. We work hard to try and connect those people with general resources. So the National Immigration Lawyers Association, things like that we try to connect them with. I'm also an attorney who can't be licensed to practice in the state when my husband is stationed. But as a consequence, this is something that I'm kind of passionate about. But the reality is no, the military doesn't
have a way of supporting military family members when it comes to helping them process their applications. The reality also is that they simply don't collect the numbers. So only the Army, out of all of the branches of the services, actually collects data on the citizenship status of spouses and family members. On the positive side of that, that's good, because my marriage is how I have that relationship to my spouse. On the other side, it means that we don't have necessarily a lot of data. We've collected a lot through our own advocacy and talking to people, but we also see through organizations like Espasa Militares Hispanas, who serve Spanish-speaking military spouses, that they estimate that there's somewhere around 9,000 to 10,000 undocumented military spouses. And so as someone who is documented, it's really important to me to kind of stand and advocate in that realm and kind of hear what you think we could be doing to kind of ease that burden. Because our military families we've been at war for 18 years, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is hard on our families.
Right.
And though I will not tell you where he is, my husband is currently deployed. And I can't even begin to imagine how much harder this would be right now, even though I'm still going through the citizenship process, if I was also undocumented. Yeah. And how much additional stress it would place on him and his ability to protect this country. Mm-hmm.
Galen?
Thank you, Galen. Galen Carey, National Association of Evangelicals. We've heard quite a bit about the undocumented, and of course people say if people would just come here the right way, go back and so on. But we've also now seen that many of the proposals that are being put forward are actually to cut back on legal immigration. So how could people, if they want people to come legally, but then they don't want them to come at all, is really, I think, the subtext of that. How does that idea get distinguished so that we could sort of recapture the support for legal immigration, which from the employment panel seems like it needs to increase, not just stay the same and certainly not be decreased?
I'd like to comment on that because Senator Langford and Senator Bennett, they were asked that question by Ali, like, what can we do? And in a recent conversation, they said, you have to have your congressman or senator think this is your number one issue, because it is a hard issue to get back on the table. And so just the grassroots organizing to say, look, we want a good solution to the myriad issues that we see. And as the American public and in our spheres of influence, we have to make it not an 18th issue, but a number one issue.
Scott, I wonder if you have, maybe you all haven't even questioned on this issue of just the perception between the problems of legal and, are people wanting restrictions on legal immigration as well as wanting to reform illegal or undocumented?
We've actually seen quite a bit of support for the reductions in legal immigration. And this is just rank and file people who don't often have all of the facts of economically what the implications are, but also, the two issues are tied. Mm-hmm. So the more we're trying to solve an undocumented issue, are we going to actually have fewer slots for people to come legally? It seems like the two are too intrinsic with each other to say if we want to get rid of people coming into the country without documentation, then here are the ways you can apply. And here are the slots we have to fill. And we have not fewer than last year, but possibly more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think what else you need to take into consideration is how we deal with the people that are already here that are undocumented, because there are a lot of families, millions of families that are here working hard, doing the right thing, not committing crimes, that need that legality, and we need to figure that out.
KPNM with Faith and Community Empowerment. I just want to highlight a couple of people who are legally here, but at the same time, they're not also getting the help that they need. So one is someone that we're working with who was a lifer but paid his dues, and the day that he came out, he got detained by ICE. And he seems to be someone, in our working with him, that he's someone, even within the prison system, he had decided to make a commitment to change his life. And he seems to be a stellar, candidate, doing great things for the community. But we are trying to help him get a governor's pardon. But, not many people have that kind of support around them. So I just want to put that out there as what are some things that can be done for individuals like them who have paid their dues and have reformed, and yet the system is ready to send them back. And the only reason he's not back is because Cambodia as a government, as a country, has not, at this point, accepting people from the US. But that may change.
Yeah.
And then the second individual, there's been a lot of adoptees from foreign countries, especially from Korea. And there was a case where this individual, he got adopted, but then again dropped from a series of abusive families. And, again, he became an adult, came into his own, has family, but I guess for adoptees, there isn't an automatic citizenship process. And so because of the abusive adopted parents, they never signed him up. And so then he got kicked back to their country. So I just want to highlight that there are individuals here who are legally here, paid their dues, but they're all being sent back as well.
Yeah, more of that blurring. And then there's another question right over here. That'll be our last one.
Oh, you can take it if you want to. Oh, I had a different question. Oh, okay. Well, I'll have it.
We just have time for one more. So you guys duke it out real fast over there.
I win. No, just quickly. First of all, thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to have such an esteemed panel to listen to today. And of course, I know Sheriff Mims from a long time, and wonderful to see you again.
Thank you.
But my question actually is for Ms. Hoogstra. I hope I'm saying that correctly. So you mentioned early on that you had gone to the border and met with border agents. Yeah, and I am vastly interested in what that experience was and what you heard from them, because I'm the chief of Seattle Police Department. I have Becca Boat right here, who's also a researcher as well as our legal advisor, and we're really concerned about resiliency with our officers and the types of experiences they have in the field and what we should be doing to make them whole and safe. So I'm just wondering what that is like for people who are dealing, because just looking at the images, I have no personal knowledge, but looking at the images, I wouldn't be able to, separate those children from their parents. So I was just wondering about that.
The first impression I had of our Border Patrol people was such high integrity. They were in a very tight spot, and they were having to deal with hard stories and sort of an endless crush of need. And yet they were serving with such dignity and with such professionalism. So the story in the newspaper might be that one person who does something wrong, but there are literally tens of thousands of people who are serving under such pressure with such dignity. And the second impression was compassion. So they had a sense that this was a broken system, and yet they had a job to do. They were going to do their job, and they were going to apply as much permissible compassion as possible. I think the resilience, we want our best people on those front lines. And so if you're a critical person of this system, not being critical of people who are doing their job, but being thankful and showing some gratitude for people who are doing that hard job, and asking, what do you know that we can learn about so we can be better in our work?
Meghan, yeah.
I recently went as well in August to the border, and we had a meeting with Border Patrol, and my experience was almost the opposite. When we asked them, what do you need? And they said, we need a break. We are constantly getting different directions from Washington about what to do. And this was in the Ursula Processing Center, which was really ground zero for a lot of the family separations. And they talked about, they gave us this whole presentation. It was propaganda, if I can use the word correctly, right, ladies? And they were talking about drug smugglers and human traffickers and, you know, how presenting that as if that was what they were doing. And then everything beyond that was about families and people who are coming, fleeing violence. And so there was this disconnect between what they, I think, signed up to do and what they're now being asked to do. And I asked one of the agents, I said, what brought you to this job? And he said, he came from New York, and he said, you know, I'm about to have my 10-year high school reunion, and 10 of my friends have died from the opioid crisis. And I had to do something, and this is my something, to come down here to make a difference, to stop the flow of illegal drugs into the US. And I said, well, do you feel like you're making that difference here? And he said, not really, because I'm spending my days with kids who, you know, have been walking through Mexico for weeks. And so I could sense that frustration in him, in that, you know, they want to protect this border, but what they're being tasked to do is very different. And it was in that moment that I had compassion on him.
Yep.
Because I went in there with a very hardened heart toward them and the whole system in general. But I could see in that individual person, in the same way that we ask people to look at an individual person and an immigrant, I had to have that same experience with Border Patrol.
Hard job.
Yeah. But they were frustrated.
I hate for frustrated to be the last word. But we are out of time. And maybe that's where we should all take our frustrations up to Capitol Hill. Thank you all so much.